my name is Carla Gonzalez, and I'm one of the coordinators for the Department of Sociology Race and Ethnicity Working Group.
Cool. I'm Michael Tran, also the co-coordinator. First, we'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Chicano Studies Department, the Chicano Studies Research Center, and the Contentious Politics and Organizations Working Group. We'd like to remind you that the Irene Flecknell Ross lecture series is made possible by a gift from Ray Ross in memory of his wife. And last but not least, we'd like to thank our faculty coordinator, Rubén.
And with that, introducing our speaker today, Rubén is our advisor and professor of sociology at UCLA Beaumont. Beaumont has published extensively on Latino communities. She is the author with Edward Diaz of the award-winning Generations of Exclusion, Mexican Americans, Assimilation, and Race. And recently, she was honored with the Distinguished Career Award by the Latino section of the American Sociological Association. Beaumont, we are incredibly grateful for everything that you did to help us make these events possible, from the planning to the funding and everything. Thank you very much.
These guys did all the work. I just wrote emails asking for more money, which is always fun. So thank you, everybody, for being here. Today we are welcoming Rubén Rumbaut, Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Irvine. He is internationally known for his work on immigration and refugee movements, and he's a leading expert on immigration in the U.S. His research has focused on many areas, the types of immigrants and their contexts of exit and reception, modes of incorporation and adaptation, social mobility and inequality, ethnic identity, bilingualism and language loss, education, achievement and aspiration, crime and incarceration, citizenship and membership. You get the point. He has really researched everything. He is an author of more than 100 scientific articles and chapters on the adaptation of immigrants and refugees in the United States. One of the book that he's most well known for is the critically acclaimed Immigrant America, a portrait with Alejandro Portes. It's now in its 4th edition. He is also director with Portes on the landmark Children of Immigrant longitudinal study. And from this, he's published 2 very important volumes, Ethnicities, Children of Immigrants in America, and Legacies, the story of immigrant second generation. He's also served as a principal investigator of the immigration and intergenerational mobility in metropolitan Los Angeles study. He has served in many leadership roles in sociology, including being founding chair of the section on international migration of the ASA, an elected member of the ASA Council, and most recently, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So I could go on. The bio was very long. This is just a selection of what was in the bio. So instead, I will let Professor Rumbaut speak. His talk is Reflections on Immigrant America, from the Great Inclusion to the Great Expulsion. So thank you, Rubén, for being here.
Thank you, Vilma, very much for the very long and generous introduction. It's a pleasure for me to be back here at UCLA. Even though in the middle of a 1,200-year drought, there's actually sightings of rain outside. The pleasure is extra when I'm not only introduced by an old friend, but I was invited here by 2 of my former and my best students at UCI, Carla and Michael. They really are extraordinary people, and really, Carla and Michael are the reason that the first reason that I am here. They made me an offer I couldn't refuse, which is that all they had to do was ask, and I'm here. I propose to talk for about an hour and then open it up for another half hour for Q&A. I'm going to make a kind of formalish opener, and I'm going to end it with another kind of formalish ending. But in between, it's going to be informal, and I'll try to get personal and so on, as I mentioned to Michael and Carla in planning this. I try to title the talk provocatively, Reflections on Immigrant America, from the Great Inclusion to the Great Expulsion. That Great Inclusion to Great Expulsion frame that I have in mind is particularly the last 50 years, but you'll see why I'm trying to provoke interest by framing it that way. Although, as I was telling the group that I was with at lunch just now, really you can go back to the colonial period and you can interpret all of U.S. history as a dialectic of inclusion and exclusion. But that would take us very far afield. Now, I begin by calling it Reflections on Immigrant America. Clearly that's a double entendre. By Immigrant America, I'm referring not only to the country, and I'll be talking about what has changed in the United States over the last half century, but also to our book, Immigrant America. But I should and could have also called this Reflections on an Immigrant World, because the world is increasingly on the move. Just last year, the United Nations reported that there were 232 million international migrants worldwide, most of whom were born in the global south and migrated to the global north, reflecting widening global inequalities and intractable conflicts. I am one of them. I assume that any number of you in this room are as well. These 232 million and counting are largely self-selected border crossers, and they represent 3% of humanity. The other 97% are stayers, living in the countries where they were born. Moving to a foreign country is not easy, even under the most propitious of circumstances. Those who do tend to be young and intrepid souls, which is what makes migration the selective process that it is. But the border crossing process is accelerating. Between 1990 and last year, for example, the number of international migrants worldwide rose by 50%, almost 80 million people, with much of this growth occurring between 2000 and 2010. These dynamics forge sites not only of cultural and demographic transformations, but also of social and political collisions that predictably elicit a range of nativist and exclusionary responses. Since World War II, labor migration has flowed increasingly from poorer to richer countries and from younger to older countries. Refugees, the least desirable migrants, move mainly from one poor country to another. Today, only 1% of the population of less developed countries are foreign-born, compared to more than 10%, well over 10% now, of the populations of more developed countries who are foreign-born. These more developed countries have declining fertility, aging workforces, and economies that generate significant demand for both immigrant professionals and often unauthorized low-wage laborers. Moreover, historical ties, as I'll mention a little later on, between countries underlie contemporary migrations. They are rooted in colonialism, in war and military occupation, in labor recruitment, in economic exchange. Once migration footholds are formed, family networks expand, remittances link communities across national borders, and all of this turns migration into a self-sustaining process. More immigrants, a fifth of the world's total, go to the United States than to any other country. I will focus here on the story of Immigrant America, as I said, especially over the last half century, from its historic nadir in 1970 to its resurgence as a nation of immigrants, and now to deportation nation. From the Great Inclusion to the Great Expulsion. I'll examine the historic transformation of the U.S. into this new nation of immigrants along two narrative axes, diversity and inequality. And as I said a moment ago, the subtitle is a double entendre, referring both to the country and to our book, Immigrant America. New editions of our book, Immigrant America, have been written and published in each of the last 4 decades. The first edition we wrote in the 1980s, the second in the 1990s, the third came out in 2006, and the fourth edition came out last August, in August of 2014. And every time we finish an edition, we get this gnawing feeling that it's obsolete already because the world is changing faster than we can keep up with it. And so here comes the motivation to start working on the next edition and to try to grapple with a vertiginously changing world and with this permanently moving target of a society. Now, I don't know if you can notice, but that is Cuba. That's a satellite photo. That's where I'm from. And this is Havana. And that's my hometown. It's on the northwest coast of Cuba, as you can see in the satellite photo. And if you follow that wispy trail of clouds from Havana up north across the Florida Straits, about 100 miles to the northeast, you'll see Miami. And that's where I ended up. I came here over 50 years ago, almost as if I had been following that wispy cloud from Havana to Miami, a city on the edge of the peninsula where I began my own Latin journey. And we began it with $450 for a family of 7. I was the oldest of 5 children. We had 5 cardboard suitcases, little bitty aluminum frame. There had been a run on suitcases in Havana. By the time we left, and there were no suitcases left in the whole island, so they only had these little cardboard things, really bright orange. You could see them from miles away with a little aluminum frame. And we had to pretend to be going only for a 2-week. We had never been out of the country. We spoke no English. We had no contacts, no jobs. We knew no one, and we were clueless about what would happen next. My father and mother were almost 40. When I think about this now, take 5 children, I was 12 and I was the oldest, and then you go all the way down to 5, and you just go and you don't know what's going to happen next, and you have no, that is, it takes a lot of gumption, a lot of courage. So in a way, I started making a career out of reflecting about Immigrant America long before I started writing about it. Now this is a poster for a major conference we've organized at UCI next October to mark 2 golden anniversaries. And this is a poster, Carla, that Luis put together. On the left, you see the iconic picture of President Lyndon Johnson signing the 1965 Immigration Act at the base of the Statue of Liberty on October 3, 1965. And then the other anniversary that coincides with his 50th anniversary, which happened just 24 hours later, is the opening of UC Irvine. The University of California at Irvine will be 50 years old on October 4th. And so to mark those 2 50th anniversaries within a day of each other, we're organizing a major conference that we've titled Transforming Migrations. I don't know if you can, it says Beyond the 1965 Act, it's the subtitle. On October 8th and 9th at UC Irvine. On the right, this is the fence in Tijuana that divides Tijuana from San Diego. It's the famous fence that more than 700 miles of which has been built with billions and billions and billions of dollars that extends all the way for about 50 feet into the ocean. As a way of symbolizing that even the ocean, you're not supposed to cross that imaginary line. And this picture is taken from a storm hit San Diego, Tijuana around 2006, and it damaged the fence. And that is a Mexican guy on the Tijuana side of the beach looking at the fence. So in a way, it kind of captures this subtitle of from the Great Inclusion, which is really the vision that animated that 1965 act to repeal the racist national origin quotas and allocate egalitarian visas to every country in the world, etc. Although there was always a cynical agenda behind it, but nonetheless, it was an inclusionary vision to the kind of exclusionary and expulsionary politics. As I wrote in the preface to the 4th edition, history does not repeat itself, but it echoes. And this goes back again and again to this theme that I already suggested earlier, that you can go back to the colonial period to look at this dialectic between inclusion and exclusion. And indeed, it kind of suggests also a deep contradiction, that a country that claims to be a nation of immigrants has become a deportation nation, in which millions of people live in a state of fear and systematic persecution by the state, experiencing summary arrest, incarceration without bail, transfer to remote detention centers, family separations, deportations without counsel, and lifetime banishment from what is in many cases the only country that they have known as home. I'll have more to say as we go along. These are the covers of the first 2 editions of Immigrant America, the one that came out in 1990, the one that came out in 1996. The painting is by Mark Tobey, which I found in the Seattle Art Museum. It was painted in 1942. The title of the painting is E Pluribus Unum, an aptly inclusive title for the painting chosen for the covers of the first and second editions. And that's the authors. This is Alejandro and me between the first and second editions. We had already started sales, and the first wave of the Children of Immigrants longitudinal study that Vilma mentioned had been completed. So you can see that it's not only Immigrant America that changes, the authors change even more. Not to mention the authors' hairlines and all kinds of other things. Nothing stays the same. Not Immigrant America and not us. Now, as soon as the first 2 waves of SILs were completed, which happened right about the time that the second edition of Immigrant America came out, we set to work to analyze the data, the longitudinal data for those 2 waves of SILs that Vilma mentioned. And that led to the publication of these 2 companion volumes, Legacies and Ethnicities, which came out in 2001. SILS would become the largest and longest longitudinal study of the children of immigrants ever done in the United States. It has since been replicated and is being replicated in Mexico and over 7 European countries. And in fact, it is still ongoing now in San Diego. And Cynthia Feliciano, who's a former PhD from UCLA, and I, and Linda Borgen, who's been the field coordinator for San Diego SILs going back to the 90s, have managed to track down a representative sample of the San Diego half of the study. They're now in their late 30s, 38, 39 years old, so that we have been tracking them since they were 14 in 8th grade. In other words, for over 2/3 of their life course, over 25 years. The stories are absolutely fascinating, and I won't be able to get into them today in this talk, but maybe during the Q&A if you're interested. Now, when the book Legacies was honored with the ASA Best Book Award at the annual meetings of the ASA in 2002, I remember noting to the group assembled that the book was dedicated to our children born in this country, our legacies, who in turn allow us to say that we not only study children of immigrants, we make them. And that is the ultimate in participant observation. The study of the story, both of the children, is critical. Both first and second generation children of immigrants already are the majority of children in many school districts and cities in the United States, and even in some states. By 2014, just last year, over 25% of all children in the U.S. under age 18, a total of 19 million, had an immigrant parent. This growth has been extremely rapid. In 1970, the child population of immigrant origin accounted for only 6% of all children. This is a cover of the third edition of Immigrant America. This permanently unchanging society kept changing. The painting this time is different. It's a 1985 painting entitled The Immigrant. You can see home is inside the heart, not outside, but inside. It's by the Cuban artist Luis Cruz Azaceta, who came on the Mariel boat lift in 1980. And that is the cover of the new edition, the fourth edition that just came out last August. It's of a 1961 painting by Jasper Jones, simply called Map. It's a color splash of the 48 states. It's now hanging in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And if you look closely, each of the states have their names, so Georgia, California, Florida, and so on, but they're all, I mean, in a way, the diversity of colors and hues and splashes this time suggests not a pluribus unum, but a pluribus pluribus, out of many, many. Here's a demographic glimpse to the future, just very briefly. Enter numbers now instead of images. This lists the largest 3 countries in the world today, and and projecting it until 2050. China, India, and the United States are numbers 1, 2, and 3. And by 2030 and by 2050, China, India, and the United States remain the top 3 countries, except that by 2030, India passes China. Right? You can see the numbers here. Mexico is the 11th largest country in the world and remains the 11th all throughout this 50-year period. Now, the group that has come to be called Hispanics or Latinos in the United States, U.S. Hispanics, if they were a country, they would be among the largest countries in the world. As of 2010, as you can see there, they were the census and the American Community Survey estimated a population of 50.5 million Hispanics in the 50 states and D.C. That's not counting the nearly 4 million U.S. citizen Puerto Ricans in the island of Puerto Rico. So if you add them, you're now talking 54.5 million. And as you would probably know better than anyone else, the flow from Puerto Rico in these very recent years has been accelerating. And they can come just like you can go from here to Nevada. I mean, they're U.S. citizens, they're not immigrants. Today, the Hispanic population, so we're now about 2015, it's almost 55 million. So if you add the nearly 4 million from Puerto Rico, we're now approaching 60 million already. The projections are, as you see there, 85 million by 2030 and over 130 million by 2050. And at that time, it would be closing in on 30% of the total U.S. population. Reduced fertility rates in the last 2 or 3 years have led to a readjustment of these estimates, and we're now talking about 133 million by 2060 instead of 2050, but it's simply a deceleration, not a change in the overall patterns. If this is a glimpse to the future, here's a glimpse to the past. Here's the evolution of the immigrant or foreign-born population of the United States from 1900 to 2010. You can see there that the Great European Migration from 1880 to 1930 peaked in 1910 when it accounted for 14.7% of the total population of the United States was foreign-born. There were actually a couple of decades before, in 1880, 1890, where the percentage had reached almost 15%. But that, in the contemporary period, is the high water mark. And then it slowed, as you can see, decade after decade after decade, beginning with the onset of World War I and then the Russian Revolution. and that era was followed by a period of retrenchment, with immigration declining further after the passage of the restrictive, exclusionary national origin quota laws of the 1920s, which essentially barred all Asian and African immigration from the United States, period, with few exceptions, and then plummeting with the onset of the Great Depression in 1930. That decade of the 1930s is the only decade in U.S. history where the U.S. population has actually lost more people than it gained during the 30s. Some of that has to do not only with immigrants not coming in here, or where are you going to come in the middle of a depression, but also with close to 1 million Mexicans being forced out. Not just Mexican immigrants, but over half of the near million or so that are estimated to have been repatriated were actually U.S. citizens. So the term repatriation does not quite work. They were forcibly or voluntarily removed in what has been called the decade of betrayal of the 1930s. Almost a third, according to the book Decade of Betrayal by Francisco Valderrama and by Kevin Johnson, now the Dean of the School of Law at the University of California at Davis, almost a third of the Mexican origin population of the United States was expelled during that decade. In yet another largely forgotten, at least forgotten outside of Chicano studies courses, expulsion. We're in the middle of another great expulsion today. I'll have more to say about it in a moment, but I wanted not to lose sight of the fact that this is not the first time that this has occurred in human history, in U.S. history. There has been, the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. Ironically, just less than a year after the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed, Emma Lazarus wrote her famous Paean to the Statue of Liberty, the Mother of Exiles, beckoning the homeless tempest-tossed to me as she lifts her lamp beside the golden door. That was totally forgotten when all these laws in 1917 and then the 1920s were passed, until the signing at the base of that same Statue of Liberty by Lyndon Johnson in '65 that essentially repealed national origin quotas. So you can see how the exclusionary and inclusionary movements move back and forth. This is the Mexican origin population in the United States from 1850 to essentially the present. It's over 34 million today, just an enormous number, of which about 12 million or so are immigrants today from Mexico. And you can see how the population was increasing hardly at all. There you have the 1910 Mexican Revolution, you see an increase there, and then all of a sudden, especially for immigrants, you can see this little bump. If we were to magnify, that's where you can begin to see the nearly 1/3 or so that is lost there. It doesn't look like much in the graph, but in a time of economic crisis during the Depression, hundreds of thousands were removed from California, Michigan, Colorado, Texas, Illinois, via a campaign by federal, state, and local officials that violated the legal rights of those repatriated and of those not removed but who were nonetheless stopped, interrogated, and detained. The campaign of raids and roundups and people being herded into trains and buses all the way to the border traumatized and terrorized the greater Mexican American community. Families were torn apart with no semblance of due process of law. And this also delayed for decades the full emergence of Latinos as a political, economic, and social force in the United States. It would be 30 years plus, almost 40 years, before the Chicano movement, for example, would emerge in the United States. As I said, history may not repeat itself today, but it echoes. Now, of the top 10 countries of immigration in the U.S. today, there are about 40 million. As of 2010, there were 40 million immigrants in the United States. They come from 200 different countries and from all over the world. But only 10 countries account for 60% of all of these 40 million immigrants in the United States. And those are the 10 countries. And as you can see, Mexico accounts for the lion's share, 29%. And then it's followed by China, if you include Taiwan. If you don't include Taiwan, then India would now actually be second. The Philippines had been second for the last 40 years until now. It's just slightly behind India and China, the two largest countries in the world that have been, especially India, immigration from India since around 1995 has just been zooming. And then El Salvador. El Salvador actually passed Cuba, which Cuba is this line here that has been cut off at the bottom. They're more Salvadoran foreign-born in the United States and have been now for about 10 years, and they're Cuban foreign-born, even though the Salvadoran immigration did not get really started until about 20 years after the Cuban immigration. So you have El Salvador, Vietnam, Cuba, Korea, the Dominican Republic, and Guatemala. So of the top 10, 5 are Latin American countries, 5 are Asian countries, not including, as I said, Puerto Rico. Where do they settle? Well, duh. Right here. The audience already kind of reflects the table. But those here are the 10 countries again, the top 10 countries, from Mexico down to Cuba and Guatemala. Here you have that's as of 2010, so here you have the 12 million, 1.8 million. This time China comes in fourth because now Taiwan is not included, so you can see the difference. And this is the share of the total foreign-born. So altogether, they amount to about 60%. And you can see where they settle: California, 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 California. Whoops. Who would that be, I wonder? But even the Cubans, the third main state is in California. That must include me and a few others, in the. Then Korea, Dominican Republic, that's the other outlier, so it's a New York, New Jersey story, and then Florida, and then Guatemala. And when he says California, most of those who say California are Southern California. And when he says Southern California, most of them are in LA County. And when he says LA County, most of them are right here in LA. This is a map of all the 3,135 counties in the United States as of 2000, because at that time we still had census data. We no longer have the census anymore. The long form of the census went bye-bye, and what we do have is the American Community Survey, but the American Community Survey doesn't get at each of the 3,135 counties. But you can see that the darker the hue and the darker the blue, the greater the percent share of the foreign-born in each county. And there's Dade County, and Broward and Southern Florida. Here you have the U.S.-Mexican border from Brownsville and so on down up to Laredo, to El Paso, and then continuing through Arizona till you get to California. You see all California is blue. And then you see, Chicago, Detroit, obviously the Washington, D.C. to New York and Boston corridor here. You're now beginning to see little spots of blue in North Carolina and then the Atlanta area, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, in Washington State. But you have this huge amount of white in the middle. These are places where, is Sebastian here? Yeah, the exotic one.
Yeah.
These are places where you would be seen as an exotic person. I would be seen as an exotic. But in these other places, they're either seen as threats or they have already taken over. And so now in 2010, here's how the story has shifted. The top 6 states of quote unquote mainstream gateways of immigration are California, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois, which is really New York City, Chicago, right. Now California is pretty much California. Now these are the mainstream states of immigration only from today's perspective. But I remember in the 1980s in California, when California was what today is called a new destination. Back in 1960, which is not that far away, Los Angeles was the whitest, most Protestant city in the United States, with one of the fewest share of foreign-born of any major city in the United States. Los Angeles, this city, I mean, it's almost unfathomable that it happened like that. But the same way that states like Alabama and the Carolinas and Georgia and Utah and so on are freaking out now about immigrants and trying to pass all these ordinances and all these state laws and so on to control. And those are those yellow states. The 10 yellow states are the states that show the fastest growth rate in immigration from 1990 to 2010. The blue states are the ones that have the largest number of immigrants, right? So these yellow states are the ones that have been called, quote, the new immigration. During the 20 years in question, the immigrant population doubled from almost 20 million in 1990, 19.8 million in 1990, to 40 million in 2010. So from 20 to 40 million, right? It doubled. But the rates of growth in the yellow states, in North Carolina, it grew by 525%. In Georgia, 444%, 429% in Arkansas, 388% in Tennessee, and so on. By contrast, the growth rate in California was 57%, which was actually below the national rate of immigration growth of 102%. But 57% growth in California and 50% in New York, you have to apply that rate to the denominator, and the denominator is huge. So 57% means that the immigrant population in California grew from 6.5 million to 10.2 million. Almost 4 million people were added, immigrants were added to California. 4 million people is more than the sum total of all immigrants in all of the 10 yellow states, even though the rates are 500, because look at what the denominator was. It was 115,000. We almost have that many at UC Irvine. I'm exaggerating a little. For sure, we have that many. The total immigrant population of Arkansas fits as immigrants in UC Irvine or children of immigrants in UC Irvine. And UCLA, well. So those are patterns of settlement. Geographic diversity. Here's another aspect of diversity, and that has to do with language, one that was especially contentious in the 1980s here in California and many other states passing English-only laws and so forth. Here you can see the pattern of change from 1980 to 1990, 2000, and 2010. 100 years ago, in 1910, nearly 15% of the U.S. population was foreign-born. Remember that 14.7 for 1910 that I had shown earlier? Those 14.7% amounted to 13.5 million immigrants. And of those 13.5 million immigrants back in 1910, 3.5 million spoke English as their mother tongue. They were immigrants, but they hailed from Ireland and Great Britain and Canada. German was by far the largest non-English language spoken, with about 2.8 million speakers, and that was followed by Italian, Yiddish, Polish, Swedish, French, Norwegian, and in 10th place was Spanish, with only 250,000 speakers in all of the United States in 1910. As mass European immigration waned, as we saw over the subsequent decades, so did linguistic diversity. In 1970, in fact, remember that was the nadir when the foreign-born population reached only 4.7% of the total population. It was in 1970. And that year, 1970, the Census Bureau, in its wisdom, stopped asking its question on mother tongue. At that time, English, at 1970, English was still the language spoken by the largest number of immigrants, over 1.7 million, again drawn chiefly from Canada, the UK, and Ireland. but by then it was followed now in second place by Spanish, although still the majority spoke English of the immigrants. And then Italian, German, and so on just started whittling down. That year of 1970 marked the end, comparatively, of the most linguistically homogeneous era in US history. So when people try to make comparisons, they forget that this has been a polyglot country from the beginning, from the colonial times to the present, and that comparisons to the period from the 1950s and 1960s, you're talking about the linguistically most homogeneous era in US history. But by 1990, as you can see there, 32 million people, 31.8, or 14% of the 230 million people in the United States aged 5 years and older, when the separate questions started being asked in the census at that time, said that they spoke a language other than English at home. That doesn't necessarily mean that they speak that other language fluently, or that they can read it and so on, just that that language is spoken at home, right? But still, that's a significant increase, and those figures went up sharply still in the year 2000, right? From 32 million to 47 million to 60 million people. Now that's real change, who say they speak a language other than English at home in 2010. That's over 20% of the American population speak a language other than English at home. And there are many languages that are spoken, but Spanish by now is the predominant one. You can see what's going on now. Only 11 million used to speak Spanish, or 5% of the population, at home in 1980. By 2010, 37 million, or 12.6% of the total population, said that they spoke Spanish at home. That, of course, doesn't necessarily mean, I don't have time to get into it now. We can do it at the break, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will always speak Spanish and they will speak it just like Cervantes, any more than George Bush could speak English like Shakespeare, even though that's the only language he knew, although he claimed to speak a little bit of this broken Spanish that was really, anyways, it was just for show. But the fact remains that over time in the US and generation, and especially among the younger ones and so on, English wins. English, if you don't use it, you lose it. The language of the immigrant parents shrinks. The vocabulary goes down. The English accent goes up. Then by the time they get to their teen years, they feel embarrassed to even use it when their parents talk back to them. I know, because my son only heard me ever speak in Spanish to him in Michigan until he was 5.5 years old. And that one day, he caught me speaking in English to my stepdaughter and said, "Papi, ¿tú hablas inglés?" Oh, the gig was up. But that's the only way that we could raise a bilingual child. My wife and I, she's Mexican, speaking in Spanish to him. And it was us against Michigan. And so I only spoke Spanish to him no matter what. And if he ever said anything to me in English, I would say, ¿qué? And he would give me the complete translation. When he was like 3 or 4 and driving him here or there, he even said, in Spanish of course, he said, "Papi, tú hablas español mucho mejor que yo, pero yo hablo inglés mucho mejor que tú." Así que he was telling me how he was going to help me out with English, just as I help him out in Spanish. I just kept the ruse. Today he's bilingual, but with an accent, and during the years of darkest adolescence, you speak to him in Spanish, he only answers back in English. I mean, that is what happens to languages in this country. It is ironically the country that has received more multilingual people than any other country in world history, and yet in no other country has a shift to monolingual English occurred as rapidly, earning this country the dubious distinction of being a language graveyard. And you think that in a global economy, the ability to speak another language fluently is a real asset. It's a human capital asset. It's a national security asset. After 9/11, when the CIA and the NSA and the FBI and so on, all these security agencies were trying to intercept, and get radio intercepts in Urdu and Pashto and so on, there was not one person who could speak those languages. So in order to be able to translate what was being picked up through the radio chatter, they went to, guess where? Salt Lake City, Utah. It's the Mormons that are the only ones that are serious about knowing another language. And they had to kind of recruit some Mormon speakers of these languages to help them out. Even when the Iraq War was just about to end in the calamity that was widely predicted, and that report came out about 2007 or so, by then the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, it was and remains to this day the largest U.S. embassy in the world and ever, with over 1,000 personnel full-time. The report noted to his amazement that only 6 U.S. personnel in that entire embassy were fluent Arabic speakers in Baghdad. This is a distribution geographically by the percent of people who indicate that they speak a non-English language at home. This is by states in rank order and by the top metro areas, the top 20. Again, California, 43% of the 39 million people in California speak a non-English language at home, although again, that doesn't necessarily mean how fluently they speak it or how literate they may or may not be in it, followed by New Mexico, Texas, New York, New Jersey, and so forth. Top metros on the U.S.-Mexico border, McAllen, where my father-in-law died and is buried. He was an undocumented immigrant who crossed the border from Mexico with less than a second grade education as a 16-year-old in the 1940s. And he went on to work his tail off for 30 years in the steel industry, in the steel mills of Detroit, and gave a lot more back to this country than, including all of the children that he had that have gone on to make tremendous contributions to the American society, to the American economy, to the American Academy. Miami, 73%. Jersey City, this is, Miami is Havana, USA. Jersey City is Havana, USA #2. The Cubans are on this side of the Hudson. They don't stay in New York City, unless they're Chinese Cubans and then they go to New York City. It's a very interesting. And then here's LA, 57% as of 2010 reported speaking a non-English language at home. And look at all the CAs: San Jose, Orange County, Fresno, San Francisco, Riverside, and Bakersfield, and Ventura. And down here, this is San Diego, California, that is hidden away, was 36%. U.S. immigrants are extraordinarily diverse in many aspects, not only language, not only their patterns of settlement, etc., but also in their levels of education. By far, the most educated people in the United States today are immigrants. By far, the least educated people in the United States are also immigrants. And so when people try to reduce categories, natives versus immigrants, it is apples and oranges. It's worse than apples and oranges. Apples, oranges, minerals, vegetables, meats. So you can see immigrants from India, for example, are by far the most highly educated people in the country, with 3/4 of adults having college degrees, and over half of them having advanced degrees. It's not just 4-year degrees. And then you have Taiwan, Nigeria. In fact, if you break it down by continent, the continent with the most highly educated immigrant population in the United States is not Asia, despite the Asian American whiskey model minority stereotype. It's Africa. It's Africa, Asia, Europe, and then there's this huge drop to Latin America, because and you can see, Mexico is the largest immigrant group, but also the least educated, followed by El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. These 4 also happen to be 4 countries, the majority, more than 50% of whose immigrants are undocumented. And that has a lot to do with the human capital profiles that we're seeing here. you can see the European countries in the middle. Now this is a particularly key chart to the rest of the story. And I'm going to try to keep it to another 10 minutes or so that we can have plenty of more time. I already mentioned that immigrants to the U.S. are hugely diverse in terms of their national origins, in terms of their class origins, their cultural backgrounds, their migration histories, their phenotypes, but also in terms of their legal statuses. This chart looks at, again, at the largest immigrant groups, but by two key dimensions along which immigrants to the U.S. differ. One is their level of education, and the other is their legal status, how the government classifies them in terms of residency status. So we can identify three main types. Immigrants with low education and irregular entry, meaning that more than half of the immigrants are here on an undocumented status, and more than half have less than a high school education among adults. So that's a double whammy, right? To this group can be added Honduras, but Honduras is not yet in the top 10, although it's getting there. And you find them especially here now in LA County and so on. A second group is the exact opposite. They're high education, regular entry. So these groups, over half of them have college degrees, and in the case of India, 3/4 of them have college degrees. And the great majority of them enter through regular immigration channels. However, that doesn't mean that there are no undocumented immigrants among them. Using the government, the Department of Homeland Security's own sources, I estimate that as of 2010, 8% of the Chinese and Taiwanese are here without legal permanent residency, without green cards. They may be visa overstayers or what have you. India, the most highly educated country in the US, 11% are undocumented. Philippines, almost 16%, as are Koreans. In other words, the largest countries of legal immigration to the United States, with the exception of Cuba, are also the largest countries of undocumented immigration in the United States. And why is that? Because to immigrate to the United States legally, through regular entries, you have to go meet certain preferences in US law. It used to be, for example, the fifth preference was for brothers or sisters of US citizens. So if an immigrant comes here from the Philippines, becomes a US citizen, and then sends away for a brother or a sister to come, they can come under the fifth preference. But people in the first four preferences have to get priority queue location first. It's kind of like going on Southwest Airlines and getting on the A thing or the B thing or whatever. It's one of those. So brothers and sisters are like the last group to board. And if you hit the 25,000 visas a year for a given year, then you just get moved on to the next year. Back in the mid-90s, when the Philippines was the second largest immigrant group after Mexico, it used to be that brothers and sisters of Filipinos who had become US citizens who wanted to immigrate to the US had to wait, on average, 45 years. And many of the current categories, you have to wait 20, 30, and so on years. Most people are not going to wait till they're ready for hospice to get on the plane to come to the United States. That defeats the whole point of family reunification. So they end up coming with tourist visas or so, and then after 6 months they overstay their visas, and they become part of the 11-point-some million undocumented in the country today. About 40% of whom are estimated to be visa overstayers. And then you have a third category that come in as refugees, as state-sponsored immigrants. And they have a mixed human capital profile. So they're not as much a brain drain, professional immigrant type of immigrant like these folks, nor are they labor migrants in undocumented status like those folks. Cuba says NA for the undocumented because under a law passed in 1966, Cubans are the only immigrant group in the United States that essentially are exempted from being undocumented under the now under the so-called dry foot, wet foot policy. So long as you reach the United States and you put 1 foot in dry or semi-wet beach land, you're in. And you get to pass go, collect $200, and after 1 year you get your green card. If you're a Haitian on the same boat and you arrived with the same 1 foot in dry land, you go right to the Chrome Detention Center and then you're deported. The Cuban is a special. This is a statement by Doug Massey in a recent article in Daedalus to which I completely adhere. I'm going to go very quickly now. This is a photo that I took right here in downtown LA in March 2006 during that huge march that reached almost 1 million people in downtown protesting H.R. 4437, the so-called Sensenbrenner bill that had just been recently passed by the House of Representatives, which would have made felons of an estimated 12 million undocumented immigrants at the stroke of a pen, and would have made felons also of anyone who would assist them, including the Catholic Church. At that time, the head of the Catholic Archdiocese of Los Angeles, the largest archdiocese in the United States, was Cardinal Roger Mahoney, and he penned an op-ed in the New York Times that I still vividly recall on March 22nd, just 4 days before this march took place, in which he basically called on the 60+ million Catholics in the United States to commit civil disobedience if the Sensenbrenner bill were to pass, because the Catholics needed to obey the law of God and not the law of Sensenbrenner. This calling for mass civil disobedience in that scale on the op-ed of the newspaper of record, that was something. You got to Google it. But anyways, I was there with my wife from 7 in the morning on, documenting the whole events that took place in Los Angeles that day. And Los Angeles was only one of many cities throughout the country. Millions went with white T-shirts and so on to protest on behalf of immigrant rights. That's a familiar sign, familiar icon. That's the City Hall of Los Angeles, and that's a sea of white T-shirts on that day on March 25, 2006. California today is home for more than a quarter of all the 40-some million immigrants in the country. Back in 1990, California was home for a third of all the immigrants. So its share has declined somewhat, as it has gone from 6 million to 10 million, and so on. But still, over half of California now is first or second generation immigrants or U.S.-born children of immigrants. California has been a majority-minority state since the year 2000. Texas became majority-minority in the year 2009. The whole dang United States is on course to becoming a majority-minority country by 2043 or so. But already most major cities, etc., are already that. That leads to people assuming that demography is destiny, and that this is a cover in Time magazine in March 2012. 2012 was a presidential election year, as you know, and it was prophetic because in November of that year, President Obama was reelected with over 70% of the Latino vote, nearly 80% of the Asian American vote, and well over 90% of the black vote. And here in Los Angeles, you remember the kosher burrito, who's now your mayor. He's Jewish and Latino, and so on. And so, people try to... this was just, May 21, 2013, that's when he got elected. And by the way, as an aside, just the breaking news came out last month, but it turned out that Jeb Bush, who's now running for president in this coming next presidential year, he registered as Hispanic in 2009. Did you see that? He registered, and now he's been walking it back, and all that. So you think that all of these things suggest that, hey, people like Mexican food, they like rancheras, salsa sales surpassed ketchup sales in 1988 already. Tortillas are a lot more preferred than white bread, and on and on and on. So you think that, hey, and people like me marry Mexicans, right? Everyone I know is married to a Mexican. I mean, given the numbers, I even recommend it. But anyways, you think that this must be a moment of great inclusion going on. But for every action, there's a reaction, and for every exotic immigrant, there's one that's perceived as threatening. Such as what happened just last July, just an hour from San Diego. This is an infamous image of fission and exclusion, not of fusion and inclusion. This is Murrieta, California. You remember when all those unaccompanied minors were arriving at the border, the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas, fleeing violence in Honduras and Guatemala and so on. So some of these children were put in buses and they were being sent to detention centers. One of them was the ICE detention facility in Murrieta. And the mayor of Murrieta incited the folks of Murrieta to do this. And they would not allow the bus to go past their blockade, and they forced that official federal bus to turn around and go back to San Diego and deal with the children someplace else, but not in Murrieta. You can see the faces of inclusion there in the crowd. And then, of course, you have the back and forth. For every action, there's a reaction. The social world is a dialectic. It is full of conflict. It is not linear. It is not additive. It is not decontextualized. And again, history is not like General Electric's old slogan, progress is our most important product. Demography counts, yes, hugely, but demography is not destiny, nor does it come with guarantees. You can see it in cartoons. This is when, Alabama is one of the many states that came out with their own anti-immigrant laws right after Arizona. Arizona was basically copycatting Proposition 187 in California from 1994, and then they started doing that after the impasse with comprehensive immigration reform basically just became total paralysis after 2006. The Sensenbrenner bill didn't pass, but neither did the comprehensive immigration reform, and ever since it has been all about enforcement. And Alabama passed its own law in 2011. So you have whites only in 63. You remember what happened in Selma, Alabama in 65 with Bloody Sunday, the movie that came out earlier this year, the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and on and on and on, the bombings in Birmingham, etc., etc., etc. Well, what the Sensenbrenner bill did not achieve, several states have. They have criminalized the mere presence of undocumented immigrants. They empower state and local police officers to enforce immigration laws that are not only incredibly complex, but also encroaches on a historical federal responsibility. And all of this has typically led to improper and racially based applications of law. And at the local level, cities and municipalities have enacted ordinances to target undocumented immigrants and to exclude them from critical services, making them more vulnerable to identification, detention, and deportation. The bulk of this has happened to Latinos. Here's another part of this contradiction that I was pointing to earlier. Help wanted, cheap disposable labor to keep our profits going through the roof, and wanted for immediate deportation, the very same people that are being wanted for their labor. So today the situation is nothing short of schizophrenic, with agricultural interests clamoring for the same type of worker that ICE is deporting. The U.S. government is setting up a revolving door where Mexican workers, for example, are thrown out of the country for deportation on the one hand, and welcome as H-1B visa, H-2 visa holders on the other. It's kind of reminiscent of the 1930s. A couple of more things I want to leave you with in telling in reflecting on Immigrant America and changes over time in these 50 years. One is that alongside with all the other dimensions that I've been talking about, educational diversity, diversity in legal status, language, culture, etc., etc. It's important to understand that even all that is only part of a much more complex story. This period from around the early 70s to the present has also coincided with widening inequalities, especially in income and wealth. So that the incorporation and prospects of social mobility of immigrants and their children has hinged on their levels of education probably more than ever in history, beginning in the early 70s and accelerating thereafter. The structure of the American labor market started to change under the twin influences of technological innovation and foreign competition in industrial goods. In this changed labor market, high demand exists at the low end for unskilled and menial service workers, and at the high end for professionals and technicians, with diminishing opportunities for well-paid employment in between. It's part of what has been called this new hourglass economy that has been bifurcating into major occupational categories. The Great Recession of 2007-2009 exacerbated these widening inequalities in income and especially in wealth, so that by 2009, for instance, the net worth of Black and Hispanic households, which for homeowners is largely based on their home equity, was wiped out in the wake of the collapse of housing prices and of the deep recession that followed. Net worth among Hispanics, for example, dropped to a minuscule $6,000, and the wealth gap between whites and Hispanics rose to 20 to 1, the widest in the 25 years since they have been measuring. And not only is inequality increasing, but so is mobility shrinking. And in fact, mobility and inequality are connected. This graph shows patterns of income inequality for a number of OECD countries measured by the Gini coefficient, so that the further you go to the right, the higher the level of inequality in a country. This axis is a measure of economic mobility, so that the lower you go in the graph, the higher the mobility, and the higher you go, the more restricted is economic mobility. So you can see that countries like Finland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden have low inequality and high mobility, whereas the United States, along with Italy and the United Kingdom up here, the United States is the most unequal country, and it ranks third and almost tied for first in the least mobile society. So the idea, ironically, of the United States as a land of opportunity and Horatio Alger and so on, well, the United States is no longer the proverbial. That curve, by the way, that you see has been referred to as the Great Gatsby curve by Alan Kruger, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. I'm running out of time, so I won't have the opportunity to get into the Great Gatsby curve. But levels of inequality are strongly correlated with many other things. Among them, the number of prisoners, the rates of incarceration, prisoners per 100,000. The more unequal the country, the higher incarceration rates. Look at Singapore. One of the cleanest cities in the world, but you can get caned for chewing gum and littering. I've been there. My wife wants a 6-day, 6-night all-expense trip to Singapore on The Price is Right. So we got to go there a few years ago, so I can attest to all these rules about the gum and so forth. It's a true story. The U.S. has less than 5% of the world's population, but the United States incarcerates 25% of the world's prisoners. This is the rate of incarceration of the United States today. It is the highest, not only in the world, but the highest in world history. This is just looking at incarceration rates in the United States from 1920 to about now. And you can see that from decade after decade after decade, the rate of incarceration remained pretty stable. and pretty much in line with rates of incarceration in other countries. But again, beginning around the 1970s, and it's too bad that that's cut off at the bottom, but that's 1970, and especially from 1980 to 2006, incarceration just boomed. It doubled from 1980 to 1990. It doubled again from 1990 to 2000, partly in function of the war on drugs, and then 3 strikes and you're out law, mandatory sentencing, taking judicial discretion away from judges in sentencing. And in fact, California now, this is California's prison population. Here's you can see in the late 70s where it starts in 1980, and then boom. California incarcerates more people in the prisons of this state than almost any country in the world except about 5 or 6. Like Russia, Ukraine, China, and South Africa, and a couple of others. It's the emergence of the penal state in the United States that's particularly striking. And what has come to be known as the new Jim Crow, right? But the new Jim Crow has been also expanding alongside what might be called a new Juan Crow. And that, here's the number of unauthorized or undocumented immigrants in the United States from 1990 after IRCA passed. Remember the amnesty with IRCA? And so by around 1990, the estimate was that there were about 3 million undocumented immigrants in the country. By 2007, the estimate was 12 million. So the undocumented population in the United States quadrupled during that period of time, despite the fact that the border was militarized beginning in 1993, border patrol resources were quadrupled, and on and on and on. You'd think that that would have stopped illegal immigration. It quadrupled it, with all kinds of unanticipated consequences. And instead of people going, say, to the usual places for seasonal work, like to pick from Oaxaca to pick tomatoes in North San Diego County, and then after the end of the harvesting season, you go back home, so you see all the flow going back for Christmas and so forth. Instead of that, the militarization of the border jacked up the risk of the journey and the cost of the journey, because now you couldn't just come across from Tijuana to San Diego in a festive atmosphere, you wait till dusk and then you just walk across. Now you have to hire coyotes, and now you're paying them $3,000 a head, and now it's become far more dangerous terrain. Now you have to go through the Sonora Desert in Arizona. Hundreds of people die a year. And so just paying the coyote means that the money you were coming to work at cheap wages in order to meet economic needs at home, you're now going to have to stay here a lot longer to earn the money so that you can pay the coyote and send the remittance. And as a result, you are not going to see your wife and kids for a much longer period of time. So what people started doing is saying, well, let's just get the whole family together and we're all going to migrate. We're all going to pay the big to the coyote, but once, not every single time I have to go back home, back and forth. And because we can't afford to go back, we'll just stay. So one of the unintended consequences of this fiasco has been to turn a population of sojourners into a population of settlers. And settlers who are now not just in the usual suspect states of California, Texas, and so on, but now they're found in all 50 states, including Hawaii, and in Alaska's Sarah Palin's hometown of whatever that name is. I forget the name of where she could see Russia from her porch. What's her name? There's now a Mexican restaurant there, all that kind of stuff. This is, it was not expected, but this is what happens. And this is a population that's now trapped inside the United States because they don't have papers, so they cannot go back home. Because if they do, they cannot come back again, and going back now is risky. So you can see how that has increased. Now, why am I putting this on the board? As we saw earlier, a lot of the people coming from Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras are young men with less than a high school education from ethnic and racial minorities. That is what criminologists say is the profile for people who commit crimes. So you think, well, look, if all this incarceration is going up, maybe it's because the unauthorized immigrants are young men from ethnic and racial minorities with less than high school, and they're the ones that have something to do with the crime rate and hence the incarceration rate. But during the same time that unauthorized immigration was reaching historic highs, the crime rate in the United States was going down and reaching historic lows. That is the case for all violent crimes, aggravated assault, robbery, rape, murder, and for property crimes, down, down, down. I did a study of incarceration rates, native-born and foreign-born. And I found, for instance, in 2000, the incarceration rate for the native-born young men, ages 18 to 39, were 5 times the incarceration rate of foreign-born young men. And for those from countries that are preponderantly undocumented immigrants, Mexico, El Salvador, and Guatemala, the rates were even lower. So the idea that immigrants bring crime to our communities and so on is exactly wrong. Immigrants come here to work, and they come here to stay the heck away from any police or any. They don't want to violate a single rule, let alone commit felonies. And you can see that this is across the board. If you were to unpack this, this goes for every single ethnicity or nationality without exception. This is the gulag of detention centers that have been created in the United States to indefinitely detain undocumented immigrants. This is all over the country. There are 3 in Orange County. One of them I visit with my wife every Friday. We go see someone who's been disappeared there because they have no rights. They don't have the right to make a phone call if they don't have any money. And if they have money, they have to pay $25 for a phone card and then $3 for a connecting fee. It's all for profit operate, and then 50 cents a minute for a local call. So the first fellow I went to see, I picked out the one who had been there the longest without a single visitor. He was a guy from Guerrero who had been there for over 6 months. His eyes were glazed. I mean, he was just hunched over. A picture of a demoralized man. His eyes well when I told him that he didn't know who I was. I didn't know who he would be. He was a guy from Guerrero who had been working in Santa Ana for 13 years, minding his own business, and he was picked up by ICE and dumped in there. When I told him that, I'll be visiting you every week. I'll tell you more about it in just a second, but this is the story of deportations. This is deportation nation. This is the Great Expulsion that I'm talking about. This is from 1900 to the present. Just under the Obama administration, more than 2 million people have been deported. Most of them are not criminals who have committed anything that you or I would call a quote-unquote crime, including these people that I've been visiting. This is a letter that man wrote me. That's him after ICE, after we had gone through heck and back. I got him a pro bono attorney. We got a bond hearing in immigration court here in LA. We got $2,500 to get him out on bond. And when he went to report to his second ICE meeting, these 3 NFL linemen looking pushed me out of the way, took him in, and said that we're taking him into custody. The next thing I knew, they just put him in a van, and 3 hours later they had dumped him in Tijuana without a penny, without his birth certificate, with nothing. He had my number and got somebody to be able to call me. I was the only person on earth that could cross the border to be able to bring him some money, his birth certificates, some of his clothes, etc. And I've now done this in a second occasion. But this is being done routinely. It doesn't get covered by the newspapers because they're not allowed in these detention centers. But that's how many there are. And I better stop, except I'll end with, I'm sorry, Sebastian, but this is not the most optimistic note to end it on. But just because you deport someone, the story doesn't end there. You're separating entire families. One of the projects I'm involved with right now is a transnational study, Mexico, California, of transitions to adulthood from people that were all come from the same town in Jalisco. Some of them stayed, some of them migrated with their parents to California, and so we're following them longitudinally to see what happens to those that migrated, the leavers and their stayers. In Guadalajara, which is about 2 hours from where this city is, that I'm investigating. The freight trains that are best known as La Bestia, these are freight trains that carry hundreds of immigrants on the roof of these trains as they make their way from Guatemala and El Salvador and then through Veracruz, and they hang a left and they go all the way to the border. And immigrants know by the numbers on the train which ones go to the border and whether they go to the east or the west or whatever. But when they pass through one of these colonias in Guadalajara, the train slows down. And at that point, immigrants often jump off the train to rest for a couple of days, ask for money in corners, get a little bit of food, get a little bit of sleep on the roadside in a row of homeless people. And then a couple of days later, they get back on the train. So within an hour, I found about 15 different, and I interviewed about over a dozen of these immigrants. They were all from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. This guy's name is Vladimir. He was picked up by ICE in New York City. He had a 10-year-old son in New York City. He was put in detention there and then shifted off to Indiana and then to Texas, and from Texas they deported him to El Salvador. As soon as he arrived in El Salvador, do you think that deportation means that the story ends there? No, he has a 10-year-old son in New York, and by God, he's going to go see his son. So he climbs on La Bestia, and off he goes on La Bestia. So as the train makes a left around Veracruz, it starts to rain. And you have to be really alert. I mean, they're narco guys that are trying to steal from you, that are trying. And so he was hanging on, but the rain made him lose his grip. And the vacuum of the train just sucked him under, as it does hundreds and hundreds of these immigrants who end up amputees. It severed his leg and dragged him for about 300 meters. If you saw his face, all his teeth are all broken. Along the route of these railroad tracks, there are little mini clinics, impromptu mini clinics that have sprouted just to minister to these kinds of accidents. They amputated, they gave him the spare crutches and gave him some food, and about 2 months later, when he got his energy back, he jumped on the train again. So he had just jumped off the train in Guadalajara when I chanced across him and a fellow from Honduras that were doing this together. This is a 20-year-old from Guatemala who came with two friends, and the two friends abandoned him. Then he got beaten up by the Mexican police, who stole whatever little money he had. He was completely depressed. I gave him some money so he can get some food. He didn't know which was worse, to go back to Guatemala or to try on his own. He didn't think he could make it because he didn't know where he was going. He said he thought he was going to go to Minnesota. He had no idea where that was or why he was going. Somebody had told him that. These guys are from Honduras. This one already tried it once, and he lost his hand when he fell off the train. They said they wanted to go to Tennessee. This guy is also from Honduras, a 19-year-old with two little children already back in Honduras. And the stories that this guy told would make the stories of Voltaire in Candide, look like a picnic. But I don't have time, so I better stop here. And thank you very much for your attention. Comments, questions, critiques? Yes, sir.
Just a little statistic there to add to yours. When I was in elementary school back in the 30s, they used to brag that Los Angeles was the second largest Mexican city in the world.
Briefly. Now it is again. Now it's the second largest Mexican city in the world after Mexico City, back again. If you include the entire metropolitan area, the numbers of well over 5 million of Mexican origin now surpass the numbers in Guadalajara and in Monterrey. But for a period there in the 30s, the idea was to shrink that reputation. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering if you can make two comparisons, because your talk was mostly focused on the United States. First of all, how do you think about this Great Expulsion in relation to the Great Expulsion,